She was given away for a barrel of whiskey at 20. He found her in ruin and whispered, "Come with me." Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, late summer. 1878. The saloon doors hung crooked on their hinges, one side dragging against the warped floorboards with every gust of wind that rolled through the narrow street. The air inside was thick with the stench of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and the sharp bite of cheap tobacco. Sunlight barely cut through the grime-streaked windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. A piano stood silent in the corner, its keys chipped and yellowed like old teeth. The bartender, a heavy-set man with a greasy apron tied over his gut, wiped down the counter with a rag that looked dirtier than the wood itself. Around him, a handful of men hunched over their drinks, faces half hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, eyes glazed with liquor and indifference. But it was the girl in the corner who drew the eye. Not because she was beautiful, though once she might have been, but because she looked so utterly out of place. Cassidy Merrick sat on a low stool near the back wall, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her shoulders curled inward as if trying to make herself smaller. Her dress was torn at the sleeve, the fabric faded and stained, and her dark hair hung in tangled strands around a face that was pale and hollow-cheeked. Her eyes, once bright with life, now stared blankly at the floor, empty as a dried-up well. There was a bruise on her forearm, yellowish and fading, and another darker one just below her collarbone where her dress had slipped. She didn't bother to cover them anymore. What was the point? Her father, Silas Merrick, stood near the bar, one boot propped on the brass rail, his voice loud and slurred as he haggled with the barkeep. He was a wiry man with a weathered face and mean eyes, the kind of man who blamed the world for his failures and took it out on anyone weaker than himself. In his hand, he gripped the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping him upright. His breath reeked of rot-gut whiskey, and his shirt was stained with sweat and God knew what else. He'd been drinking since dawn, and now, as the afternoon heat pressed down on the town like a hammer, he was desperate. "I ain't got coin," Silas barked, slamming his palm down hard enough to rattle the glasses. "But I got something worth more than coin. You want her or not?" The bartender glanced over at Cassidy, then back at Silas, his expression unreadable. He was a thick-necked man with a scar that ran from his ear to his jaw, a relic from a knife fight years ago. He'd seen plenty of desperate men come through his doors, but this was something else. "What am I supposed to do with a girl?" "Whatever you want," Silas said with a shrug. "She can clean, she can cook, she can pour drinks. Hell, she can warm a bed if that's what suits you. Point is, she's yours for a barrel of whiskey. Good whiskey, mind you. None of that watered-down swill you're serving these fools." The bartender leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, considering. A barrel of whiskey wasn't cheap, but girls weren't exactly hard to come by in a mining town like Copper Ridge. Still, there was something about the way Silas was practically vibrating with desperation that made him pause. "She got any fight in her?" Silas laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Hell no. Beat that out of her years ago. She do what you tell her, no fuss." Cassidy didn't move. She didn't flinch. She sat as still as stone, her breathing shallow, her hands gripping the fabric of her skirt so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She had heard her father say these words before, in different places, to different men. This was the third town in as many months. Each time, he promised her it would be the last. Each time he lied. Each time, she believed him a little less. The bartender scratched his jaw, his fingers rasping over stubble. "A whole barrel?" "A whole barrel," Silas confirmed, leaning in closer, his eyes bright with greed. "And she comes with no strings. You don't like her, you can toss her out. I won't come asking for her back. Hell, I won't even remember her name by tomorrow." A murmur rippled through the room. A few of the men at the tables turned to look, their faces shadowed beneath their hats. One of them, a grizzled miner with a tobacco-stained beard, spat into a tin cup and shook his head. Another just laughed, low and mean, and went back to his cards. Cassidy felt their eyes on her like insects crawling across her skin. She wanted to stand up, to scream, to run. But her legs wouldn't move. Her voice wouldn't come. She had learned long ago that fighting only made things worse. So she sat, and she waited, and she prayed silently for the ground to open up and swallow her whole. The door to the saloon swung open, and a man stepped inside. The room didn't fall silent, not exactly, but the noise shifted, dulled, as if the air itself had grown heavier. He was tall, his frame lean but powerful, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He wore a worn leather vest over a dark shirt, and his long black hair was tied back with a strip of rawhide. His skin was sun-darkened, his features sharp and defined, and across his cheekbone ran a thin scar that caught the light. He was Apache, a warrior. And the way he carried himself, the way his eyes swept the room with calm authority, marked him as more than that. He was a war captain. Degataga Standing Bear moved through the saloon like a shadow passing over stone. He didn't glance at the men drinking at the tables. He didn't acknowledge the bartender or Silas Merrick. His gaze found Cassidy, and it stayed there. It was a strange thing, the way he looked at her. Not with hunger or judgment, but with something quieter. Something that felt almost like recognition. She felt it before she saw him. A shift in the air. A presence that demanded attention without asking for it. Slowly, she lifted her head, and their eyes met. His were dark, deep as a canyon at twilight, and they held something she hadn't seen in a long time. Not pity, not lust. Something closer to understanding. Silas turned, following the bartender's stare, and his lip curled when he saw Degataga. "This is a private matter," Silas said, his voice sharp with irritation. "Move along, Redskin." Degataga didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable, his gaze never leaving Cassidy. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the piano player, who had been lazily plinking out a tune in the corner, let his hands fall silent. When Degataga finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of a man who did not waste words. "How much?" Silas blinked, momentarily thrown. "What? How much for the girl?" Degataga repeated, his tone flat and deliberate. The bartender leaned forward, suddenly very interested. Silas's eyes narrowed, suspicious but intrigued. He looked Degataga up and down, taking in the leather vest, the worn moccasins, the absence of coin purse or saddlebag. "You got whiskey?" "No," Degataga said simply. "But I have something better." He reached into the pouch at his belt and pulled out a leather cord strung with polished turquoise stones, each one the size of a man's thumb, gleaming like pieces of captured sky. He set it on the bar with a soft clink. The room went dead quiet. Even the men at the tables turned to look, their cards forgotten. Turquoise like that was worth more than whiskey. Worth more than gold in some circles. It was the kind of wealth that could buy land, horses, a new life. Silas stared at the stones, his mouth working silently, torn between greed and confusion. His hand twitched toward the necklace, but he didn't touch it yet. "Why the hell do you want her?" he asked, his voice suspicious. Degataga's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "That is not your concern. She's my daughter," Silas shot back, puffing up like a rooster. "I got a right to know. You lost that right the moment you traded her for drink," Degataga said, and the words landed like stones dropped into still water. There was no anger in his voice, no judgment. Just truth, cold and undeniable. Silas's face flushed red, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment, it looked like he might swing. But then his eyes flicked back to the turquoise, and his shoulders sagged. Greed won out over pride, as it always did. He snatched the necklace off the bar, tested the weight of it in his hand, and grinned. "Fine, she's yours." "Good riddance." Cassidy's breath caught in her chest. She looked at her father, searched his face for any flicker of regret, any hesitation. There was none. He turned away from her without another word, stuffing the turquoise into his coat pocket, already planning how he'd spend it. Already forgetting she existed, Degataga walked toward her slowly, his boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The men at the tables watched him warily, hands drifting toward knife hilts and pistol grips, but no one moved. He stopped a few feet away from Cassidy and crouched down so his eyes were level with hers. For a long moment, he said nothing. He just looked at her, really looked, as if he were trying to see past the dirt and the exhaustion and the fear. "Come with me," he said quietly. His voice was rough, like wind over stone, but there was something gentle beneath it. Something that didn't demand, only offered. Cassidy stared at him, her throat tight, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She didn't understand. Didn't know what he wanted, what he expected. Men always wanted something. Why? She whispered, her voice cracking. "Because no one should be treated like a thing," he said. "And because you deserve better than this." Tears stung her eyes, hot and sudden, but she blinked them back. She didn't trust tears anymore. They had never saved her before. They had only made her father angrier, made the men who bought drinks at bars laugh harder. But something in Degataga's voice, something in the stillness of his gaze, made her believe him. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. She stood on shaking legs, her hands clutching the tattered edges of her shawl. Her knees felt weak, like they might give out at any moment, but she forced herself upright. Degataga rose with her, and without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. Cassidy followed, her steps slow and uncertain, her eyes darting back once to where her father stood counting stones with trembling fingers. He didn't look up, didn't say goodbye, didn't even acknowledge her existence. Outside, the heat hit her like a wall. The sun blazed overhead, turning the dirt street into a river of dust and glare. The town of Copper Ridge sprawled around them, a ragged collection of wooden buildings and canvas tents, all of it coated in a fine layer of red dust. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. A wagon creaked past, its driver not even glancing their way. Life went on, indifferent and unrelenting. A black horse stood tethered to the post, its coat gleaming like polished stone, its ears flicking toward Degataga as he approached. It was a beautiful animal, strong and proud, with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything. Degataga untied the reins and swung up into the saddle with practiced ease, his movements fluid and sure. Then he extended his hand down toward Cassidy. She hesitated, staring at his outstretched palm. It was rough, scarred, the hand of a man who had seen war, who had survived things she couldn't imagine. But it was steady. It didn't waver. She placed her hand in his, and he pulled her up behind him with a single smooth motion. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her cheek pressed against the leather of his vest, and felt the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was strange, being this close to someone, feeling the warmth of another body, the solidness of it. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been touched without violence. He urged the horse forward, and they rode out of Copper Ridge without looking back. The town shrank behind them, swallowed by dust and distance, until it was nothing but a smudge on the horizon. Cassidy closed her eyes and let the wind pull at her hair, let the heat soak into her skin, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. It was a fragile thing, that hope. Small and trembling, like a candle flame in a storm. But it was there. They rode for hours in silence, the landscape shifting from barren flats to rocky hills dotted with sagebrush and juniper. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. The air cooled slightly, and Cassidy felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. She didn't know where they were going. Didn't know what would happen when they got there. But for now, in this moment, she was away from Copper Ridge, away from her father, away from the saloon and the men who looked at her like she was nothing. Eventually, Degataga guided the horse off the trail and into a shallow canyon where a thin stream trickled over smooth stones. The sound of the water was soft and soothing, a gentle counterpoint to the harsh silence of the desert. He dismounted and helped Cassidy down, his hands steady and sure, never lingering, never taking more than was necessary. "We will rest here tonight," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Cassidy nodded, too tired to speak. Her legs trembled as her feet touched the ground, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse. But she steadied herself, one hand gripping the saddle horn, and watched as Degataga unsaddled the horse with quick, efficient movements. He laid out a blanket near the stream, started a small fire with flint and dried grass, and then set about gathering wood from the scrub brush nearby. He worked in silence, his presence calm and unobtrusive. And for that, she was grateful when the fire was crackling softly, sending up thin tendrils of smoke into the darkening sky. He pulled a piece of dried meat and a handful of cornmeal cakes from his saddlebag and offered them to her. She took them with trembling hands and ate slowly, savoring each bite. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had in days. The meat was tough and salty, the cakes dry and crumbly, but to her, it tasted like salvation. After a while, Degataga sat across from her, his back against a boulder, his eyes on the fire. The flames cast flickering shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp planes of his cheekbones, the thin line of the scar. He looked tired, she realized. Not physically, but in some deeper way. As if he carried a weight that never fully lifted. "You do not have to be afraid," he said quietly, his eyes still on the fire. Cassidy looked up at him, her voice hoarse from disuse. "How do you know I'm afraid?" "Because I have seen fear," he said simply. "And I have known what it is to be taken from one place and brought to another without choice." She studied him in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the sadness that lingered in his eyes like smoke. "Why did you take me?" she asked, the question barely more than a whisper. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if he were looking at something only he could see. Then he said, "Because I saw you, and I remembered what it feels like to be seen as nothing. And I decided that if I could stop it, even once, I would." Cassidy's chest tightened, a pressure building behind her ribs that felt almost like pain. She looked down at her hands, at the dirt under her nails, the bruises on her wrists that were fading to green and yellow. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You do not need to," Degataga said, his voice steady and sure. "Just come with me. Stay alive." "That is enough," she nodded, and for the first time in years, she felt something other than despair. She felt possibility. It was a strange feeling, unfamiliar and almost frightening in its newness. But it was there, warm and real, nestled in the hollow of her chest where hope had once lived. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks up into the night. Above them, the stars began to emerge, bright and countless, scattered across the sky like grains of sand. Cassidy wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and lay down on the hard ground, her body aching but her mind quiet. Across the fire, Degataga settled into his own blanket, his hand resting near the knife at his belt, his eyes half closed but watchful. And as the night deepened and the desert grew cold, Cassidy closed her eyes and let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, her life was about to change. The journey north took 3 days. They traveled through country that seemed carved from bone and fire, vast stretches of red earth broken only by twisted mesquite and the occasional stand of ponderosa pine clinging to rocky slopes. The sun was merciless during the day, turning the air into something thick and shimmering. But at night the temperature plummeted, and Cassidy huddled close to the fire Degataga built with practiced efficiency. He never spoke unless necessary, and she found herself grateful for the silence. Words had been used against her for so long that their absence felt like relief. On the second day, they passed a burned-out homestead, its skeleton framed black against the sky. The walls had collapsed inward, and wild grass grew through the floorboards where a family had once lived. Cassidy stared at it as they rode past, wondering what had happened, whether anyone had survived. Degataga didn't slow down, but she saw his jaw tighten, saw the way his hand moved briefly to the rifle strapped to his saddle. There were stories in this land, written in ash and blood, and she was beginning to understand that he carried his own. By the third afternoon, the landscape began to change. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills covered in juniper and pinyon, and in the distance, she could see mountains rising like sleeping giants against the horizon. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, touched with the scent of pine resin and sage. Degataga guided the horse down a narrow trail that wound between boulders and ancient rock formations, and then they crested a rise. And Cassidy saw it. A valley spread below them, green and impossibly alive after days of dust and stone. A river cut through the center, its water glinting silver in the afternoon light, and along its banks grew cottonwoods and willows that swayed gently in the breeze. Scattered across the valley floor were clusters of wickiups, traditional Apache dwellings made of bent branches and brush, their shapes low and rounded like the hills themselves. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and she could hear voices carrying on the wind. The laughter of children, the whinny of horses. Degataga reined in the horse and sat for a moment, looking down at the valley with an expression she couldn't quite read. Pride, maybe, or longing. He glanced back at her over his shoulder. "This is my home," he said simply. Cassidy's throat tightened. She had no idea what to expect, no idea how she would be received. She was a white woman in an Apache camp, brought here by a war captain who had traded turquoise for her life. What would they think of her? What would they see when they looked at her? They descended into the valley slowly, the horse picking its way carefully down the rocky trail. As they drew closer, people began to notice them. A woman carrying a water jug paused and shaded her eyes with her hand. A group of young men tending horses near the river stopped their work and turned to watch. Children playing with a ball made of wrapped hide froze mid-game, their eyes wide and curious. Degataga rode straight through the center of the camp, his back straight, his face composed. He didn't explain, didn't announce. He simply brought her in, and the people parted to let them pass. Cassidy felt every gaze like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. Some faces were curious, others skeptical, a few outright hostile. She kept her eyes down, her hands gripping Degataga's vest, trying to make herself as small as possible. He stopped in front of a wickiup that sat slightly apart from the others, larger and more carefully constructed. An older woman stood outside it, grinding corn in a stone metate, her movements rhythmic and sure. She looked up as they approached, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. Her hair was streaked with silver and pulled back in a single braid, and her face was lined with years of sun and hardship. She said something in Apache, her tone clipped and questioning. Degataga dismounted and helped Cassidy down before responding. His words were quiet but firm, and though Cassidy couldn't understand the language, she heard her name spoken, heard the cadence of explanation. The older woman's eyes flicked to Cassidy, taking in the torn dress, the tangled hair, the bruises that still shadowed her skin. Her expression didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. She simply nodded once and went back to grinding corn. Degataga turned to Cassidy. "This is Nalin. She is the grandmother of the camp. You will stay with her." Cassidy blinked, startled. "You're leaving me?" "I have duties," he said. "Nalin will see that you have food and shelter. You are safe here." Before she could respond, he was already walking away, leading his horse toward the river where the other men waited. Cassidy stood frozen, panic rising in her chest. She was alone in a place where she didn't speak the language, didn't know the customs, didn't understand anything. She turned back to Nalin, who had paused in her work and was watching her with those sharp, unreadable eyes. The older woman said something in Apache, then gestured toward the Wickiup entrance. When Cassidy didn't move, Nalin sighed and switched to broken English. "You come. Sit." Cassidy obeyed, ducking through the low entrance into the dim interior of the dwelling. It was cooler inside, the air smelling of smoke and dried herbs. Woven mats covered the floor, and baskets lined the walls, some filled with food, others with tools and clothing. A small fire pit sat in the center, its ashes still warm. Nalin followed her in and pointed to a mat near the back. "You rest." Cassidy sank down onto the mat, her body aching from 3 days on horseback. She pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, trying to steady her breathing. Nalin moved about the Wickiup with practiced efficiency, pouring water from a clay vessel into a wooden bowl, then setting it beside Cassidy, along with a piece of dried meat and some kind of flat bread. She didn't say anything, just went back to her work, leaving Cassidy to eat in silence. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and confusion. Cassidy slept for what felt like days, her body finally able to rest without fear of being woken by her father's fists or the rough hands of strangers. When she woke, Nalin was always there, moving quietly through the Wickiup, tending the fire, preparing food, mending clothing. She didn't speak much, and when she did, it was in short, simple phrases. "You eat, you wash, you help." Slowly, Cassidy began to understand the rhythm of the camp. Women rose early to tend fires and prepare meals, their voices soft and musical as they worked. Children ran through the camp like small whirlwinds, their laughter bright and unburdened. Men returned from hunting or scouting trips with fresh game slung over their shoulders, their faces serious but their eyes warm when they greeted their families. It was a life built on cooperation and respect, so different from the harsh, solitary existence she had known. Nalin put her to work almost immediately. At first, it was simple tasks: fetching water from the river, gathering firewood, scraping hides stretched on frames to dry in the sun. Cassidy's hands blistered and bled, unused to such labor, but she didn't complain. She was grateful to have something to do, something to focus on besides the knot of anxiety that sat heavy in her stomach. And gradually, as the days passed, her hands toughened and the work became easier. The other women watched her with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. Some ignored her entirely, going about their tasks as if she were invisible. Others whispered to each other when she passed, their words incomprehensible, but their tone unmistakable. One young woman in particular, her belly round with pregnancy, glared at Cassidy openly whenever their paths crossed. Cassidy learned her name was Kiona, and she was the wife of one of Degataga's warriors. It was Nalin who explained, in her halting English, why some of the women resented her presence. "White soldiers kill our people," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, working on a basket together. "Take our land. Burn our homes. They see you, they remember." Cassidy's hands stilled on the willow shoots she was weaving. "I'm not a soldier," she said quietly. "No," Nalin agreed. "But you are white. And memory is long." Cassidy didn't know what to say to that. She couldn't change who she was, couldn't erase the color of her skin or the history that came with it. All she could do was work and keep her head down and hope that eventually they would see her as something other than a symbol of their suffering. Degataga came and went like a shadow. She would see him sometimes crossing the camp with a group of warriors, his face serious as they discussed matters she couldn't understand. Other times, he would disappear for days at a time, and Nalin would say only, "He scouts. He protects." When he was in camp, he kept his distance from Cassidy, never approaching Nalin's Wickiup, never seeking her out. It stung, though she couldn't say why. He had saved her, had brought her here, and now it seemed he wanted nothing to do with her. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Cassidy was down by the river washing clothes when she heard shouting. She looked up to see a group of children gathered on the far bank, pointing at something in the water. A little boy, no more than 5 or 6, had waded out too far and was struggling against the current, his arms flailing as the water pulled him downstream. Without thinking, Cassidy dropped the shirt she'd been scrubbing and ran. The water was shockingly cold, stealing her breath as she plunged in. The current grabbed at her skirts, trying to drag her down, but she fought against it, her eyes locked on the boy's dark head bobbing in the water. She reached him just as he went under, her hand closing around his arm, and she hauled him up with strength she didn't know she had.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
He coughed and sputtered, clinging to her like a drowning kitten, and she turned and began dragging him back toward the shore. Strong hands reached down and pulled them both out of the water. Cassidy collapsed on the bank, gasping for air, her hair plastered to her face. The boy was already being swept up by his mother, a young woman whose face was pale with terror. She clutched into her chest, speaking rapidly in Apache, her voice breaking. Then she turned to Cassidy, and for a moment, their eyes met. The woman's expression was complicated, fear and gratitude, and something else all tangled together. She said something, a single word, and then hurried away with her son. Cassidy sat there, shivering in her soaked dress, watching them go. Slowly, she became aware that a crowd had gathered, women and children and a few of the older men, all of them staring at her. No one spoke. No one moved. And then, from the back of the crowd, Nalin stepped forward. She looked down at Cassidy for a long moment, her weathered face unreadable. Then she nodded, just once, and offered her hand. That evening, when Cassidy returned to the wickiup, she found a new blanket folded neatly on her sleeping mat. It was woven from soft wool, dyed in shades of red and brown, and it was still warm from whoever had made it. Nalin said nothing about it, but when Cassidy looked at her questioningly, the older woman just smiled, a small knowing curve of her lips, and went back to stirring the stew. The next morning, Kiona approached her. The pregnant woman's face was still guarded, but the hostility had dimmed. She held out a pair of moccasins, worn but serviceable, and said something in Apache. When Cassidy looked confused, Kiona pointed at her feet, at the tattered remains of her boots, and then pressed the moccasins into her hands. "For you," she said in careful English. Cassidy's throat tightened. "Thank you," she whispered. Kiona nodded and walked away, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning, that night, as Cassidy lay beneath her new blanket, staring up at the smoke hole in the roof of the wickiup. She realized something had shifted. She was no longer just a white woman who had been brought here. She was becoming something more. Something earned. And for the first time since leaving Copper Ridge, she felt the smallest flicker of belonging. The seasons turned slowly in the valley, autumn giving way to the first whispers of winter. The cottonwoods along the river shed their golden leaves, and frost began to silver the grass in the mornings. Cassidy had been with the Apache for nearly 3 months now, and the rhythm of camp life had become as familiar to her as breathing. She rose before dawn to help Nalin prepare the morning meal, spent her days working alongside the other women, and fell into her bedroll each night with muscles pleasantly tired and a mind finally quiet. She had learned some Apache, enough to understand simple instructions and exchange basic greetings. The children had stopped staring at her and now included her in their games, teaching her how to weave grass into small animals and showing her the best places to find smooth stones along the riverbank. The women, too, had warmed to her presence, especially after word spread about how she had pulled young Tekala from the water. They still kept a certain distance, but it was no longer the cold wall of suspicion it had once been. Degataga remained an enigma. He was often gone for days at a time, leading scouting parties into the mountains or riding out to hunt with the other warriors. When he was in camp, Cassidy would catch glimpses of him across the valley, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance. But he never approached Nalan's wickiup, never sought her out, and she began to wonder if he regretted bringing her here. Perhaps she had been nothing more than a burden he'd felt obligated to shoulder. A moment of compassion he now wished he could take back. It was Nalan who finally addressed the unspoken tension one evening as they sat by the fire, preparing a deer hide for tanning. The old woman's hands moved with practiced skill, scraping away the last bits of flesh and fat with a bone tool worn smooth from years of use. "You watch him," Nalan said without looking up, Cassidy's hand stilled on the hide she was working. "I don't know what you mean," Nalan snorted, a sound that was almost a laugh. "You think these old eyes see nothing? You look for him every day. When he leaves, you are sad. When he returns, you are nervous." Heat flooded Cassidy's cheeks. "He saved my life. I'm just grateful." "Gratitude does not make the heart beat faster," Nalan said, her tone matter-of-fact. "You care for him." "This is not a bad thing." Cassidy shook her head. "He doesn't even speak to me. He acts like I don't exist." Nalan set down her scraping tool and looked at Cassidy directly. "Degataga lost his wife 4 winters ago. Soldiers came to a camp north of here. They did not care that it was winter, that there were children, that the people had surrendered their weapons. They came at dawn and killed everyone they could find. His wife, Ayana, she died trying to protect their daughter. The child died too. Only 5 summers old." The words hit Cassidy like a physical blow. She sat back on her heels, the deer hide forgotten. "I didn't know," she whispered. "How could you?" Nalan said gently, "He does not speak of it. But I tell you so you understand. He does not avoid you because he does not care. He avoids you because he cares too much, and he is afraid. Afraid to let himself feel again. Afraid to lose again." Cassidy stared into the fire, her mind reeling. She thought of all the times she had seen Degataga watching the children at play, the sadness that haunted his eyes, the way he sometimes stood alone at the edge of camp staring out at nothing. She had thought it was just the weight of leadership, the burden of protecting his people. But it was more than that. It was grief, deep and unhealed, carved into the very core of him. What was she like? Cassidy asked. His wife, Nalan smiled, her weathered face softening with memory. Ayana was like the morning sun, bright and warm and full of laughter. She could calm Degataga's anger with a touch, make him smile when no one else could. And their daughter, little Kimi, she was his heart walking outside his body. When they died, something in him died too. They worked in silence for a while, the only sound the scrape of bone against hide and the crackle of the fire. Finally, Nalan spoke again. "He brought you here for a reason. Not just to save you, but because somewhere deep inside, he is trying to save himself. To prove that not everything is lost, that there is still goodness to be found. Do not give up on him." The next morning, a runner came into camp with urgent news. Cassidy was grinding corn with several other women when she heard the commotion, saw the warriors gathering near Degataga's wickiup. The runner was young, barely more than a boy, and his horse was lathered with sweat. He spoke rapidly in Apache, his voice high with agitation, and Cassidy saw Degataga's expression darken. Within minutes, the camp was mobilizing. Warriors checked their weapons, women began packing supplies, and children were called in from their games. Nalan hurried over to Cassidy, her face grave. "Soldiers," she said. 2 days' ride south. They are looking for a band of raiders who attacked a supply wagon. The soldiers do not care if they find the right people. They will punish whoever they find first." Fear knotted in Cassidy's stomach. "What will happen?" "We will move camp. Go deeper into the mountains where they cannot follow. It is safer." The next hours were a blur of activity. The wickiups were dismantled with practiced efficiency. Poles bundled and hides rolled, everything packed onto horses and travois. Cassidy worked alongside the other women, her hands moving automatically even as her mind raced. She had heard stories about what happened when soldiers found Apache camps, had seen the aftermath once when she and her father had passed through a burned village. The memory made her sick. As the sun began to set, the camp was ready to move. Degataga stood at the head of the column, mounted on his black horse, his rifle across his saddle. He was giving orders to the warriors who would ride as scouts and rear guard. Cassidy stood with Nalin near one of the pack horses, trying to stay out of the way. That's when she saw him. A man on horseback, silhouetted against the darkening sky, riding hard toward the camp. At first, she thought it was one of their scouts returning. But as he drew closer, her blood turned to ice. She recognized that slouched posture, that shabby coat, that mangy horse. Silas Merrick. He reined in at the edge of camp, swaying in his saddle, and Cassidy saw he was even more haggard than she remembered. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot, and there was a desperate wildness about him. He scanned the camp until his gaze found her, and his cracked lips split into a grin. "There you are," he called out, his voice slurred. "My darling daughter. Come to take you home." The camp fell silent. Warriors' hands moved to their weapons. Degataga wheeled his horse around, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the intruder. He said something sharp in Apache, and two warriors moved to flank Silas. Cutting off any escape, Silas seemed oblivious to the danger. He dismounted clumsily, nearly falling, and staggered toward Cassidy. "I made a mistake," he said, his words running together. "I shouldn't have traded you. You're my blood. My responsibility. Come on now, we'll go back to Copper Ridge, start fresh." Cassidy stood frozen, every instant screaming at her to run. But before she could move, Degataga was there, his horse positioned between her and her father. He dismounted in one fluid motion and faced Silas, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. "You have no claim here," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Silas laughed, a brittle, ugly sound. "She's my daughter. I got every claim there is. You sold her," Degataga said flatly. "You traded her for stones like she was an animal. You have no daughter." "That's not for you to say, Redskin." Silas spat, his face flushing with anger. "I come to take what's mine." Cassidy found her voice then, thin and shaking, but audible. "I'm not going with you." Silas's head snapped around, his eyes locking on hers. "What did you say?" She stepped out from behind Degataga, her legs trembling but her spine straight. "I said I'm not going with you. You don't get to throw me away and then come back when it suits you. I'm not your property." "I never was." For a moment, Silas just stared at her, his mouth working soundlessly. Then rage twisted his features. He lurched forward, reaching for her, but Degataga moved faster. His hand shot out and closed around Silas's wrist with crushing force. "You will not touch her," he said, each word sharp as a blade. Silas tried to jerk free, but Degataga's grip was iron. "Let go of me," Silas snarled. "I'll get the law on you. I'll tell them you're hiding stolen goods, harboring a white woman against her will. Tell them," Degataga said calmly. "Tell the soldiers that you sold your daughter for whiskey, and that when an Apache war captain paid her price and brought her to safety, you came to drag her back. See how much they care." The fight seemed to drain out of Silas all at once. He sagged, his face crumpling. "I need money," he said, his voice breaking. "The turquoise, I spent it all. Gambled it away. I got debts. I need her to work, to earn her keep." Cassidy felt something crack open inside her. A wound she hadn't known was still bleeding. She looked at the man who had given her life, who was supposed to protect her, and saw only a hollow shell consumed by his own weakness. "You never wanted me," she said quietly. "You just wanted what I could do for you. What you could get from me." Silas's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of self-pity, not remorse. "I'm your father," he said. "No," Cassidy said, her voice steady now. "You were the man who fathered me. But you stopped being my father the day you first hit me. And you lost me forever the day you traded me away. I don't owe you anything. Not my labor, not my loyalty, and certainly not my life." Degataga released Silas's wrist and gestured to the two warriors. "Take him back to the southern trail. Give him water and food enough to reach the next town. If he returns, he will not leave." The warriors moved forward, and Silas stumbled backward, his face pale. "You'll regret this," he said, but his voice was weak, defeated. "You can't just throw me out. I'm her blood." "Blood is not enough," Degataga said. "Honor matters. Respect matters. You have neither." They led Silas away, his protests fading into the gathering darkness. Cassidy stood there, shaking, her arms wrapped around herself. She felt hands on her shoulders and turned to find Nalin beside her, the old woman's grip firm and grounding. "You did well," Nalin said softly. "You stood strong," Cassidy nodded, not trusting her voice. She looked up and found Degataga watching her, his dark eyes unreadable in the failing light. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. And something passed between them, an understanding that needed no words. "We move at dawn," Degataga said finally, his voice formal. But Cassidy heard the gentleness beneath it. "You should rest." She wanted to say something, to thank him, to ask him why he kept saving her, but the words wouldn't come. So she just nodded and let Nalin lead her away, back to the organized chaos of the moving camp. That night, as she lay in her bedroll beneath the stars, Cassidy realized something had changed. The encounter with her father should have left her shaken, broken, dragged back into the fear and helplessness she had known for so long. But instead, she felt lighter, stronger. For the first time in her life, she had stood up to Silas Merrick. She had claimed her own worth, spoken her truth, and walked away. And she had done it not because someone told her to, but because she finally believed she deserved better. In the darkness, she heard the quiet footsteps of the night watch, the soft whicker of horses, the distant call of an owl. The camp around her was a living thing, full of people who had accepted her, who had given her a place when she had nowhere else to go. She thought of Nalin's patient teaching, of the women who now greeted her by name, of the children who trusted her to watch them play. And she thought of Degataga, whose grief had not made him cruel, whose pain had not closed his heart. She fell asleep with tears on her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of transformation, of a girl who had been traded for whiskey, finally becoming a woman who knew her own value. The winter camp was hidden deep in a canyon where red stone walls rose like cathedral pillars, toward a strip of sky so blue it hurt to look at. A hot spring bubbled up from the earth here, keeping the ground soft even when snow dusted the rim rocks above. The Apache had used this place for generations, and the walls bore faint handprints in ochre and white, the marks of ancestors long gone. It was a sacred place, Nalin explained, where the earth remembered its own warmth. Life in the winter camp was different from the valley. The space was more confined, the people living closer together, and the work was harder with fewer daylight hours to accomplish it. But there was also a sense of safety here, of being held in the palm of the canyon, protected from the world beyond. Cassidy threw herself into the work with renewed purpose, and the women who had once watched her with suspicion now worked alongside her with easy familiarity. She learned to tan hides until they were soft as cloth, to sew moccasins with sinew thread so fine it was nearly invisible, to cook meals that stretched meager supplies into something nourishing. Nalin taught her the names of plants that could heal or harm, showed her how to read the sky for coming weather, and told her stories of the old days when the Apache moved freely across lands that now belonged to white settlers and soldiers. Cassidy listened and learned, and with each passing day, She felt the last traces of the frightened girl from Copper Ridge fade away. Degataga had grown more present since the night her father had come. He no longer avoided Nalan's fire, and sometimes in the evenings he would sit with them, listening to the old woman's stories or helping to repair tools and weapons. He and Cassidy rarely spoke directly, but she had become acutely aware of him in ways that made her heart beat unevenly. She noticed the way his hands moved when he worked leather, strong and precise. She noticed the rare smile that softened his face when one of the children brought him a found treasure, a pretty stone or an interesting bone. She noticed the way his eyes would sometimes find hers across the fire, holding for just a moment before looking away one morning. As frost turned the world silver and the canyon walls glowed pink with dawn, Cassidy was fetching water from the hot spring when she heard voices raised in alarm. She turned to see warriors running toward the canyon entrance, and her stomach clenched with fear. Had the soldiers found them? She abandoned the water jug and hurried back to camp, where women were gathering children and elderly, preparing to move deeper into the canyon if needed. But it wasn't soldiers. It was a group of Apache from another band, their horses thin and their faces gaunt. There were perhaps 20 of them, mostly women and children, with a handful of old men and young boys too inexperienced to be called warriors. They had been traveling for weeks, driven from their homeland by a combination of drought, failed hunting, and increasing pressure from white settlements. Their leader was a woman named Imala, her face lined with exhaustion, but her bearing still proud. Degataga and the other warriors met them at the canyon entrance. There was a long discussion in Apache, voices sometimes rising with passion, other times falling to urgent whispers. Cassidy watched from a distance, trying to understand what was happening. Finally, Nalan came to stand beside her. They asked for shelter, the old woman said. Food and protection through the winter. They have nothing left. What will happen? Cassidy asked. Nalan was quiet for a moment. Our supplies are not endless. We have enough for our people, but barely. To share means everyone eats less. Some will say no, that we cannot risk our own survival for strangers. And Degataga? He will say yes, Nalan said with certainty. Because that is who he is. He has known what it is to lose everything, to be driven from place to place. He will not turn away those who suffer as he has suffered. Nalan was right. By midday, the decision had been made. The new arrivals would stay, and the camp would tighten its belt to accommodate them. Some of the warriors grumbled, worried about stretching their resources too thin, but no one openly defied Degataga's decision. The newcomers were given space to set up their shelters, and the women of the camp began organizing what food could be spared. Cassidy found herself working alongside Amala and her daughters, helping them construct a wickiup from materials gathered in the canyon. The woman was perhaps 10 years older than Cassidy, with strong hands and tired eyes. She spoke little English, but they communicated through gestures and the occasional word. As they worked, Cassidy learned that Imala's husband had been killed 6 months earlier in a skirmish with soldiers. Her oldest son, only 14, had been taken by sickness during their journey. She had 3 daughters left, ages ranging from 10 to 4, and she was fighting to keep them alive that evening. As Cassidy helped distribute the evening meal, she realized with a start that her own portion had been quietly reduced. She looked up to find Nalan watching her, and the old woman gave a small nod of approval. Everyone was eating less, and no one complained. It was simply what was done. The following weeks were hard. Game was scarce in the winter, and hunting parties often returned with little to show for their efforts. The stores of dried meat and corn diminished steadily. People grew thinner, their faces sharpening with hunger. But there was no resentment toward the newcomers, only a quiet determination to endure together. It was during this time that Cassidy discovered she had a gift. One of Imala's daughters, the youngest, fell ill with a fever. The child burned hot to the touch, her breathing shallow and labored. Imala was frantic, and the camp's medicine woman, an ancient crone named Chenoa, mixed poultices and sang healing songs. But the fever wouldn't break. Cassidy remembered something her own mother had done when she was young. Before the sickness and despair had taken her, she asked Nalin for yarrow and willow bark, which she steeped in hot water from the spring. Then she sat with the child through the night, bathing her with cool cloths soaked in the mixture and dripping the tea between her cracked lips. She sang too, not healing songs, but the simple lullabies her mother had once sung to her, melodies she hadn't thought of in years. By dawn, the fever had broken. The child slept peacefully, her breathing deep and even. Imala wept and pressed Cassidy's hands to her forehead in gratitude. Word spread through the camp, and suddenly Cassidy found herself called upon when others fell ill. A warrior with an infected wound, an old man whose chest rattled with sickness, a woman whose childbirth had left her weak and feverish. She helped them all, drawing on half-remembered remedies and instinct, and more often than not, they recovered. Chenoa, the medicine woman, watched this development with shrewd eyes. One evening, she summoned Cassidy to her fire. The old woman's face was so lined it looked like weathered stone, and her eyes were clouded with age, but her voice was strong. She spoke in Apache, and Nalin translated. Chenoa says you have the gift of healing hands. The spirits speak through you. She wants to teach you the old ways, if you are willing to learn. Cassidy felt a surge of something she hadn't experienced in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Purpose. Yes, she said without hesitation. I want to learn, so began her apprenticeship. Every day, when her other work was done, Cassidy would sit with Chenoa and learn the properties of plants, the preparation of medicines, the prayers and songs that accompanied healing. The old woman was a demanding teacher, sharp-tongued and impatient with mistakes, but Cassidy absorbed everything like parched earth drinking rain. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was becoming something more than just a survivor. She was becoming someone with skill, with value that couldn't be traded or taken away. One evening in late winter, after a long day of grinding herbs and learning to set a broken bone using splints and binding, Cassidy returned to Nalin's fire to find Degataga waiting. He stood as she approached, his expression serious. "Walk with me," he said. Surprised, she nodded and fell into step beside him. They walked to the edge of camp where the canyon wall curved inward, creating a sheltered alcove. The setting sun painted the rocks in shades of amber and rose. For a long moment, Degataga said nothing, just stood looking out at the canyon, his profile sharp against the glowing stone. "Nalin tells me you are learning the healing ways," he said finally. "Yes," Cassidy replied. "Chenoa is teaching me. It is a great honor. She does not teach many, I know." "I'm grateful." Another silence, longer this time. Then Degataga turned to face her. "When I brought you from Copper Ridge, I did not know what would become of you. I only knew I could not leave you there." Cassidy's heart began to beat faster. "You saved my life." "No," he said quietly. "I gave you an opportunity, but you saved yourself. You worked when you could have given up. You learned when you could have stayed helpless. You stood against your father when you could have let him take you back. You did this, not me." Her throat tightened. "I don't know if I'm strong enough. Sometimes I'm still so afraid." "Strength is not the absence of fear," Degataga said. "It is moving forward despite it. And you have done that every day since. You came here." He reached into the pouch at his belt and pulled out something small. He held it out to her, and in the fading light, she saw it was a carved stone, smooth and round, with the image of a bird in flight etched into its surface.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
"This belonged to my daughter," he said, his voice rough. "Kimi, she carried it everywhere. Said it made her brave." Cassidy's eyes filled with tears. "I can't take this. I want you to have it," Degataga said. "Kimi would have liked you." She had your same fierce heart, your determination to keep going even when things were hard. I think she would want someone like you to carry this now, Cassidy. Took the stone with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of his trust, his grief, his hope. Thank you, she whispered. I'll treasure it. Degataga nodded, then did something she didn't expect. He reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers barely brushing her cheek. The touch was feather-light there, and gone in an instant, but it sent warmth flooding through her entire body. You are no longer the girl from Copper Ridge, he said softly. You are Cassidy of the Canyon, healer and survivor. Do not forget that. Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, his form disappearing into the gathering dusk. Cassidy stood there for a long time, clutching the stone, feeling the place where his fingers had touched her skin. Something had shifted between them, a door opening just slightly, letting in the first hint of possibility. That night, she lay in her bedroll with the carved stone pressed against her heart. Outside, the wind sang through the canyon, and somewhere in the camp, a mother sang her child to sleep. Cassidy thought about everything she had lost and everything she had found. She thought about the girl who had knelt on a saloon floor, worthless and afraid, and the woman she was becoming, useful and valued and unafraid to claim her place. The journey wasn't finished, she knew that. There would be more hardship, more fear, more moments when she would have to choose between giving up and pushing forward. But for the first time, she believed she would choose forward. Every single time, as sleep claimed her, she dreamed of flying, of being the bird etched into the stone, rising higher and higher until the whole world spread beneath her wings. Vast and beautiful and full of endless sky, spring came to the canyon like a whispered promise, melting the last traces of snow and coaxing green shoots from the earth. The hot spring fed new growth along the canyon floor, and the air filled with the scent of sage and wild onion. With the warming weather came renewed energy in the camp, and plans began for the return to the summer valley. But before they could move, tragedy struck in a way no one had anticipated. It started with the horses. 3 of them fell sick within days of each other, their breathing labored, their eyes glazed with fever. The camp's best horsemen tried everything they knew, but the animals died one by one. Then a child from Emila's band developed similar symptoms. High fever and difficulty breathing, and within hours, 2 more children were sick. Panic rippled through the camp like wildfire. Shenoa worked herself to exhaustion preparing medicines, and Cassidy found herself moving from wickiup to wickiup, tending the sick with whatever remedies she could gather. The illness spread despite their efforts. It wasn't the devastating plagues that white diseases sometimes brought, smallpox or measles that could wipe out entire villages, but it was serious enough. Within a week, nearly a third of the camp was afflicted, including several warriors and, most worryingly, Nalin herself. The old woman fought the sickness with characteristic stubbornness, but Cassidy could see her strength failing, could hear the rattle in her chest growing deeper. Degataga called a council. The camp couldn't move while so many were sick, but staying in one place too long made them vulnerable. Scouts had reported increased military activity in the territory, patrols searching for Apache bands to relocate to the reservations. The warriors argued late into the night, their voices rising and falling with urgency. Some wanted to move immediately, carrying the sick if necessary. Others insisted they had to wait until the worst had passed. Degataga listened to all sides, his face grave, the weight of leadership settling heavy on his shoulders. Cassidy spent her days in a blur of exhaustion, moving from patient to patient with little sleep. She ground herbs until her hands cramped, brewed teas until the smell of them made her nauseous, and sat vigil beside the sickest ones through long nights. It was during one of these nights, while tending to a young warrior named Neil who was burning with fever, that she had an idea. She remembered her mother once telling her about sweat lodges, how some tribes used intense heat to drive sickness from the body. The hot spring, she thought suddenly. What if they could use its heat somehow? She found Degataga the next morning, at the canyon entrance where he was meeting with scouts. He listened as she explained her idea, his expression skeptical at first, then thoughtful. "The heat lodge," he said slowly. "Yes, we use this for purification, for spiritual healing. But for sickness like this, I do not know. It might help," Cassidy pressed. "At least for those strong enough to endure it. The heat could break the fevers, help them sweat out the poison." Degataga studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "We will try. I will have the men prepare a lodge by the hot spring. You will oversee it. By afternoon." A sweat lodge had been constructed near the hot spring source, a dome-shaped frame covered with hides to trap the heat. Stones were heated in a fire until they glowed red, then carried into the lodge and water poured over them to create thick, breathing steam. Cassidy worked with Chenoa to select which patients were strong enough for the treatment, and one by one, they brought them into the lodge. The process was intense and frightening. The sick ones gasped in the heat, their bodies racked with shivers despite the temperature. But Cassidy stayed with each one, monitoring their breathing, cooling their faces with damp cloths, and whispering encouragement. Some emerged weaker, but with their fevers broken. Others showed no improvement, but enough responded positively. That hope began to stir in the camp again. Nowlin was one of the last to be treated. She was so weak she could barely walk, and Cassidy had to support most of her weight as they entered the lodge. The old woman's breathing was shallow and rattling, and Cassidy felt a cold fear grip her heart. She couldn't lose Nowlin, not the woman who had taken her in, taught her, shown her what it meant to belong. They sat in the thick steam for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Cassidy sang softly, the healing songs Chenoa had taught her mixed with her mother's old lullabies, creating something new and uniquely her own. She held Nowlin's hand, willing her own strength into the frail body beside her. At one point, Nowlin's breathing grew so faint Cassidy thought she had lost her, and panic surged through her chest. But then Nowlin coughed, a deep, rattling cough that seemed to tear through her whole body. She coughed again and again, bringing up thick phlegm, and finally, blessedly, her breathing began to ease. When they emerged from the lodge, Nowlin was drenched in sweat, but her eyes were clearer than they had been in days. "You are a true healer," she rasped, gripping Cassidy's hand. "My granddaughter in all but blood." The sickness began to recede after that. Not everyone survived. They lost an elderly man and one of the children from Imola's band, and the grief of those losses hung heavy over the camp. But most recovered, and by the time the dogwood trees along the canyon rim burst into white bloom, the camp was ready to move. The journey back to the Summer Valley took 4 days. They traveled slowly, mindful of those still weak from illness, and Cassidy found herself riding near the front of the column beside Degataga. He had given her a horse of her own, a gentle mare with a white blaze on her forehead, saying only that a healer needed to move quickly between those who needed her. Cassidy had accepted with gratitude, and now she sat astride the mare with growing confidence. Her body learning the rhythm of riding. They talked as they rode, really talked. For the first time since that evening in the canyon when he had given her Kimi's stone, Degataga told her about his childhood, about learning to hunt and track from his father, about the old days before the white settlers had come in overwhelming numbers. He spoke of Ayana, haltingly at first, but with growing ease, sharing memories of her laugh, her skill at weaving, the way she had challenged him and made him a better man. And he spoke of Kimi, the daughter who had loved collecting rocks and chasing butterflies, who had been fierce and gentle in equal measure. Cassidy listened, honored by his trust, and in turn, she told him about her own childhood, about her mother who had loved books and had taught Cassidy to read before the whiskey and despair had consumed her, about the years of fear and hunger moving from town to town, being traded and sold until she had almost forgotten she was human. She told him things she had never told anyone, and he listened without judgment, his dark eyes steady and understanding. One evening, as they made camp in a meadow carpeted with wildflowers, Degataga taught her to throw a knife. He stood behind her, adjusting her grip, showing her how to sight along the blade, how to release with a snap of the wrist. His hands on hers were warm and sure, and Cassidy found herself acutely aware of his presence, the solid strength of him, the way his breath stirred her hair. When the knife finally struck the target, a dead tree trunk 20 paces away, she turned with a triumphant smile and found him looking at her with an expression that made her heart stutter. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You have changed," he said quietly. "When I first saw you in that saloon, you looked like a ghost, already half gone from this world. Now you look alive, strong, beautiful." The last word hung in the air between them. Cassidy felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm not beautiful," she said automatically. Degataga reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "You are," he said firmly. "But more than that, you are brave. You are kind. You are someone who takes broken things and makes them whole. That is a beauty that goes deeper than skin." Cassidy couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she could do was stand there, feeling the warmth of his palm against her cheek, seeing something in his eyes that she had never dared hope for. He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. And when their lips met, it was gentle and careful and full of unspoken promise. The kiss lasted only a moment before they were interrupted by the sound of children laughing nearby, chasing each other through the meadow. Degataga pulled back with a slight smile, his hand lingering on her face for a heartbeat longer before dropping away. "We should return to camp," he said, his voice rough. That night, Cassidy lay in her bedroll staring up at the stars, her fingers touching her lips, remembering. Around her, the camp settled into sleep, but she felt wide awake, every nerve singing. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a saloon floor in Copper Ridge to a meadow full of wildflowers. From being worth a barrel of whiskey to being called beautiful by a man whose opinion mattered more than any other. The next day, they reached the Summer Valley. The camp erupted in joy at the sight of the familiar landscape, the river running high with snowmelt, the cottonwoods leafing out in brilliant green. There was much work to be done, wickiups to reconstruct, hunting parties to organize, gardens to plant. But there was also a sense of renewal, of having survived the winter and emerged stronger. Cassidy threw herself into the work alongside everyone else. She helped Nalin, now recovered and sharp-tongued as ever, set up their wickiup. She assisted the hunters in preserving meat from a successful elk hunt. She tended those still recovering from the winter sickness, and began teaching some of the younger women the healing arts Chenoa had shared with her. She felt woven into the fabric of the community now, not a guest or an outsider, but a true member with responsibilities and relationships. It was during a gathering one evening, when the whole camp came together to celebrate their return and honor those lost during the winter, that Amala approached Cassidy. The woman carried a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin, and her daughter stood behind her, solemn and respectful. Through Nalin's translation, Imala explained that she had made something as thanks for saving her youngest daughter's life. Cassidy unwrapped the bundle to find a dress, beautifully made from supple deer hide, decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns of blue and white. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. "I can't accept this," she started to say, but Imala shook her head firmly and spoke in rapid Apache. Nalin translated with a smile. "She says you saved her daughter's life. This is nothing compared to that debt. She says you are one of the people now, and you should dress as such. She also says if you refuse, she will be insulted, and her daughters will cry, and you will feel terrible." Cassidy laughed, tears pricking her eyes, and embraced Imala. That night, she wore the dress to the gathering. And when she emerged from Nalin's wickiup, conversation around the central fire paused. Women smiled and nodded approval. Children stared with wide eyes. And Degataga, standing with the other warriors, looked at her with such open admiration that she felt her face flush. Later, after the drumming and dancing had subsided and most people had retired to their wickiups, Degataga found her by the river. The moon was full, turning the water to liquid silver, and the air was sweet with the scent of night-blooming flowers. They walked along the bank in comfortable silence until they reached a bend where willows hung low over the water, creating a curtain of privacy. "I have been thinking," Degataga said, stopping and turning to face her. "About what I want. About what I am ready for." Cassidy's heart began to pound. "And what is that?" "I am ready to stop living in the past," he said. "To honor what I have lost, but not let it define all that I could have. I am ready to open my heart again, to take the risk of caring, of loving, even knowing that love can bring pain." He took her hands in his grip warm and firm. "Cassidy, you came into my life like spring comes to the canyon, bringing warmth after long cold, bringing growth where there was only bare stone. I want to court you properly, to see if what I feel, what I think you feel too, can grow into something lasting." Cassidy felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I want that too." Degataga pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and she rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart. They stood that way for a long time, two people who had known profound loss and profound survival, finding in each other the possibility of something neither had dared hope for: love, home, a future built not on what had been taken from them, but on what they chose to create together. Summer settled over the valley like a benediction, the days long and golden, the nights soft with cricket song and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. The camp thrived in the abundance of the season, hunters returning with deer and elk, women gathering wild berries and roots, children growing brown and strong under the endless sky. And in the center of it all, something new was blooming. The courtship between Cassidy and Degataga, conducted with the careful attention and respect that Apache tradition demanded. He brought her gifts, not the trinkets a white man might offer, but things of true value. A knife with a handle carved from elk antler, its blade sharp enough to split a hair. A length of turquoise-colored cloth he had traded for at great cost, knowing she had admired the color. A basket woven by his own hands, awkward and imperfect, but made with such care that it brought tears to her eyes. Each gift was presented formally, in front of Nalin and others, so that the whole camp might witness his intentions. Cassidy, in turn, showed her regard through action. She mended his clothing with small, careful stitches. She prepared meals that she knew he favored and left them at his wickiup. She made him a medicine pouch filled with healing herbs and hung it on a leather cord she had braided herself, each strand representing a prayer for his safety. The camp watched these exchanges with approval, elders nodding and women smiling, recognizing the ancient dance of two people choosing each other. But not everyone was pleased. There was a warrior named Kurik, a man in his late 20s with a reputation for fierceness in battle and arrogance in camp. He had lost his wife to childbirth 2 years prior, and had made no secret of his interest in Cassidy since spring. He had offered her gifts that she had politely refused, had tried to engage her in conversation that she had gently deflected. Now seeing her acceptance of Degataga's courtship, his displeasure turned to open resentment. It came to a head one afternoon at the river, where Cassidy was washing clothes alongside several other women. Kurik approached on horseback, his posture aggressive, and dismounted with deliberate heaviness. "So the white woman thinks she is too good for a warrior like me," he said loudly in Apache, his words translated by one of the women for Cassidy's benefit. "She prefers an old man whose heart died with his first wife." The women around Cassidy fell silent, their faces troubled. Cassidy straightened slowly, water dripping from her hands, and met Kurik's gaze steadily. "I prefer a man who treats me with respect," she said clearly, speaking in the halting Apache she had learned. "A man whose strength comes from wisdom, not from pride." Kurik's face darkened. "You know nothing of strength, white woman. You were bought like a horse. You have no honor, no standing to speak of such things." Before Cassidy could respond, another voice cut through the tension like a blade. "She has more honor than you show now, Kurik," Nalin said, stepping forward from where she had been grinding corn nearby. The old woman's eyes blazed with anger. She was bought, yes, but not by her choice. She has earned her place here through work and healing and courage. What have you done but boast and complain? Kurik turned his glare on Nalin. "This does not concern you, old woman. It concerns all of us when you bring shame to the camp with your jealousy," Nalin shot back. "Degataga is our war captain. If he has chosen to court this woman, it is his right. Your wounded pride does not give you the right to insult her." The confrontation had drawn a crowd now, warriors and women gathering to witness the dispute. Kurik looked around, seeing the lack of support in the faces surrounding him, and his jaw clenched. "We will see," he said darkly. "We will see if the spirits approve of an Apache war captain taking a white woman as his wife. Perhaps they will show their displeasure." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a wake of unease behind him. The women returned to their work, but the easy conversation of before was gone, replaced by worried murmurs. Cassidy felt her stomach twist with anxiety. She had not meant to cause division in the camp, had not wanted her presence to create problems for Degataga. That evening, she sought him out and told him what had happened. They sat together on a blanket outside his wickiup, the setting sun painting the valley in shades of amber and rose. Degataga listened without interrupting, his face thoughtful. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Kurik speaks from pain," he said finally. "He lost his wife and unborn child, and that grief has made him bitter. But his pain does not give him the right to hurt others or to question my choices. I don't want to cause problems," Cassidy said softly. "If my being here creates division among your people," Degataga took her hand, his grip firm. "You are not causing problems. Kurik's inability to accept change is causing problems. There is a difference." He paused, then continued. "Our people have had to change much over the years. The old ways are important, but clinging to them so tightly that we cannot adapt. That we cannot see value in new things, new people. That is a different kind of death." He lifted her hand and pressed it to his chest, over his heart. "You have brought life back to this heart. You have shown our people that healing can come from unexpected places. Some will never accept that, and I am sorry for the pain that causes you. But I will not let their fear steal what we have found." Cassidy leaned her head against his shoulder, drawing strength from his certainty. They sat that way until the stars emerged, scattered across the sky like seeds of light. The next weeks passed in a strange mixture of joy and tension. Cassidy and Degataga continued their courtship, their bond deepening with each passing day. They rode together through the valley, exploring hidden canyons and meadows where wildflowers grew in riot. They talked for hours, sharing dreams and fears, building the foundation of true partnership. Degataga taught her to track game, to read the signs written in bent grass and disturbed earth. Cassidy taught him some English, laughing at his careful pronunciation, delighted when he used the new words to tell her she was beautiful, but underneath the joy ran an undercurrent of worry. Kurik and a few other warriors, men who shared his resentment of change, had become increasingly hostile. They made comments loud enough to be overheard, questioned Degataga's judgment in council meetings, spread whispers that his attachment to a white woman was weakening his leadership. Most of the camp remained loyal, but the division was growing, and everyone could feel it. Then came the day that changed everything. A hunting party returned early, their faces grim with news. They had spotted a military patrol, 24 soldiers led by a lieutenant, camped less than a day's ride to the south. The soldiers were questioning settlers about Apache movements, and it was only a matter of time before they found the valley. The camp erupted in controlled chaos. A council was called immediately, all the warriors and elders gathering to decide what to do. Cassidy stayed with the women and children, helping to prepare supplies in case they needed to flee quickly, but her mind was with Degataga. Wondering what decision would be made, the council lasted hours, voices rising and falling from inside the large wickiup where they met. When the men finally emerged, their faces were set with determination. Degataga sought out Cassidy immediately. "We will not run," he told her. "We have done nothing wrong, and we are tired of being hunted like animals. We will meet with the soldiers under a flag of peace and see what they want." Cassidy's blood ran cold. That's dangerous. What if they don't honor the peace flag? It is a risk, Degataga acknowledged. But living in constant fear is also a risk, one that steals our humanity piece by piece. We will be cautious, but we will stand our ground. The next morning, Degataga and 5 other warriors, including a reluctant Kuruk, rode out to meet the soldiers. They carried a white cloth tied to a spear shaft, the universal symbol of parley. Cassidy watched them go with her heart in her throat, Nalan's hand gripping hers tightly. The wait was agony, hours stretching like years. Every woman and child in camp tense with fear. When the men finally returned, the sun was low in the sky, and Cassidy's relief at seeing them alive was overwhelming. But their faces told a complicated story. Degataga called another council, this time including the women elders, wanting everyone to hear what had been discussed. The lieutenant, it turned out, was not looking to force them onto a reservation, at least not immediately. He had been sent to assess Apache bands in the territory and report back on which ones posed a threat and which ones were living peacefully. He had agreed to note in his report that Degataga's band was peaceful, engaged in hunting and gathering, and posed no danger to settlers. But he had also made it clear that this protection was temporary, that pressure was growing in Washington to consolidate all Apache onto designated lands, and that it was only a matter of time. "So we have bought ourselves time," Degataga told the gathered camp. "Perhaps a year, perhaps 2. We must use it wisely, store supplies, strengthen our alliances with other bands, and prepare for the day when we may have to make harder choices." It was not the answer anyone wanted, but it was reality. And the Apache had learned long ago to face reality with clear eyes. The camp settled into an uneasy acceptance, grateful for the reprieve, but aware of the sword hanging over their heads. In the aftermath of the meeting with the soldiers, something shifted in the camp's attitude toward Cassidy. The women who had been most suspicious of her began to soften, recognizing that the white woman who had been traded for whiskey was not the same as the white soldiers who hunted them. Cassidy had proven herself through a hard winter, through healing their sick, through standing beside them rather than above them. Even Kuruk's hostility seemed to diminish, though whether from genuine acceptance or simply exhaustion, Cassidy couldn't say. As summer ripened toward autumn, preparations began for a marriage ceremony. Degataga had formally asked Cassidy to be his wife, and she had accepted with a full heart. The ceremony would take place at the autumn equinox, a time of balance between light and dark, summer and winter, a fitting symbol for the union of 2 people from different worlds. Naleen and the other women helped Cassidy prepare, teaching her the rituals and responsibilities of an Apache wife. Imala and her daughters created a second dress for her, even more beautiful than the first, white deerskin decorated with elaborate beadwork and shells that chimed softly with movement. Chenoa made a special medicine bundle for the couple, filled with herbs for fertility, harmony, and long life. The whole camp buzzed with anticipation, the excitement a welcome relief from the tensions of recent weeks. The night before the ceremony, Cassidy sat alone by the river, watching moonlight dance on the water. She thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the saloon in Copper Ridge, where she had been worth a barrel of whiskey to this moment, on the eve of marrying a man she loved deeply, surrounded by a community that had become her family. It seemed impossible, like something from a dream rather than her actual life. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Degataga approaching. "You should be sleeping," he said, settling beside her on the bank. "Tomorrow will be a long day." "I couldn't sleep," Cassidy admitted. "I keep thinking about everything that's happened. About how different my life is now." Degataga took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Do you have regrets?" "No," she said immediately. "Not a single one. I just want to be worthy of this. Of you, of the people who have accepted me. You are already worthy," Degataga said firmly. "You have been worthy from the moment I saw you kneeling in that saloon and recognized the strength it took to keep living through everything you had endured. That strength has only grown, and it is one of the many reasons I love you." It was the first time he had spoken those words aloud, and they hung in the air between them, precious and perfect. Cassidy turned to face him fully, her eyes shining with tears. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't know I could feel this way. Didn't know it was possible to be this happy." He kissed her then, soft and deep. And the river sang around them, ancient and unchanging, bearing witness to their promise. The ceremony the next day was beautiful in its simplicity. The whole camp gathered as Degataga and Cassidy stood before Chenoa, who performed the blessing. Their hands were bound together with a woven cord, symbolizing the joining of their lives. They shared bread and water, representing the commitment to sustain each other. They exchanged gifts, Degataga giving Cassidy a necklace made from silver and turquoise, Cassidy giving Degataga a bow she had helped craft with her own hands. And then they were pronounced husband and wife, and the camp erupted in celebration. There was feasting and dancing that lasted long into the night. Children ran wild with joy, women sang traditional songs, and warriors performed dances that told stories of courage and love. Cassidy danced until her feet ached, laughing and breathless, feeling more alive than she ever had. When she and Degataga finally retreated to the wickiup that would now be theirs together, the camp's celebration continued behind them. A joyful noise that spoke of community and continuity. Inside the wickiup, in the flickering light of a small fire, Degataga pulled Cassidy close. "You are mine now," he said softly. "And I am yours. Whatever comes, we face it together." "Together," Cassidy agreed, her heart so full she thought it might burst. The weeks that followed were perhaps the happiest of Cassidy's life. She settled into her role as Degataga's wife, managing their household, continuing her work as a healer, and finding joy in the small rituals of daily life. She woke each morning beside the man she loved, worked through the day surrounded by people who valued her, and fell asleep each night feeling safe and cherished. It was everything she had never dared dream of, but as autumn deepened and the leaves began to turn, word came that would test everything they had built. A messenger arrived from another Apache band to the east, bringing news that the government's patience had run out. New orders had been issued. All Apache were to report to designated reservations by the spring, or face military action. The time they had bought was running out. The camp gathered to hear the news, faces grim with the weight of impossible choices. Some argued for compliance, saying it was better to accept the reservation than to die fighting an unwinnable war. Others insisted on resistance, preferring death with honor to life in captivity. The debate raged for days, tearing at the fabric of the community. Through it all, Cassidy stood beside Degataga, supporting him as he tried to find a path that would keep his people safe without destroying their spirit. She held counsel with the women, listening to their fears and hopes, helping them prepare for whatever decision would be made. And in the quiet moments, when it was just the two of them in their wickiup, she reminded him that they had each other, that love was its own form of resistance against a world that tried to steal everything. In the end, the camp decided to stay one more winter in their valley. To celebrate the seasons they had always celebrated, to live as Apache for as long as they could. Come spring, they would assess the situation and make their final choice. It was not a perfect solution, but it was the best they could do. As the first snow began to fall, dusting the valley in white, Cassidy stood with Degataga, watching their people go about the business of living. Children played in the snow, women prepared evening meals, warriors told stories around fires. It was ordinary and extraordinary at once, this simple act of continuing, of refusing to let fear steal the present while worrying about the future. Whatever happens, Cassidy said. Her hand in Degataga's, we have had this. This time, this love, this life we have built. No one can take that from us. Degataga pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. You were traded for a barrel of whiskey, he said quietly. But you are worth more than all the gold in the world. And I will spend every day we have making sure you know that. Cassidy closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of pine smoke and snow, feeling the solid warmth of her husband beside her, hearing the sounds of the camp that had become her home. She had been given away once, treated as worthless, but she had found her way to worth through her own strength and the love of people who saw her true value. She was no longer the girl from Copper Ridge. She was Cassidy, wife of Degataga, healer to her people. Woman who had claimed her own life and made it into something beautiful. And as the snow fell softly around them, covering the valley in a blanket of white, she knew with absolute certainty that she was finally, truly home. 2 years later, spring 1881, the valley had changed. But not in the way Cassidy had once feared. The wickiup still stood along the river, smoke still rose from cooking fires, and children still played in the meadows where wildflowers bloomed in riotous color. But there were new structures too. A wooden schoolhouse at the eastern edge of camp where Cassidy taught reading and writing to any child who wanted to learn. Both Apache and the occasional settler's child, whose parents had made peace with their neighbors. A larger healing lodge stood near the hot spring, where Cassidy and 2 apprentices she had trained tended to the sick and injured, their reputation spreading far enough that even white settlers sometimes came seeking help. The threat of forced relocation had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something more complex. A new Indian agent named Charles Whitmore had been assigned to the territory, and unlike many of his predecessors, he seemed genuinely interested in understanding the Apache rather than simply controlling them. He had visited the camp twice over the past 2 years, and while tensions remained high during these visits, he had been impressed by what he found. A peaceful community, engaged in hunting and farming, causing no trouble to nearby settlements, and even providing medical care to whites who came seeking it. He had written reports to Washington recommending that Degataga's band be allowed to remain on their traditional lands as a trial program. The bureaucrats back east had not fully approved, but neither had they sent soldiers to enforce removal. So the camp existed in a state of uncertain grace, choosing to live fully in whatever present they were given. Cassidy stood outside the healing lodge on a morning when the air smelled of sage and rain-washed earth. She was 7 months pregnant, her belly round and prominent beneath the deerskin dress she wore. Her hands rested on the swell of life inside her, feeling the baby kick and shift with remarkable vigor. It still amazed her sometimes, this miracle that her body could create life, that she and Degataga would soon have a child who would carry both their stories forward. She heard footsteps and turned to see her husband approaching, leading 2 horses. He had been out since before dawn, scouting with a group of warriors who kept watch over the valley's approaches. His face was weathered by sun and wind. New lines carved around his eyes and mouth, but when he looked at her, those eyes still held the same warmth they had on the day he had whispered, "Come with me," in a saloon doorway. "You should be resting," Degataga said, though his tone was gentle rather than scolding. He had learned over 2 years of marriage that Cassidy's stubbornness about work was as much a part of her as her compassion. "I was just checking on Niall," Cassidy replied, referring to the young warrior who had broken his leg in a fall from his horse 3 days prior. "The swelling is going down nicely. He'll be walking again within the week, though I warned him not to try riding for at least another month." Degataga reached her and placed his hand over hers on her belly, feeling their child move beneath their joined palms. A smile tugged at his lips. "And how is this one?" "Active," Cassidy said with a laugh. "I think we're going to have a warrior on our hands. Or maybe a healer who won't sit still." He kissed her forehead, then her lips. "Come, I want to show you something I've been working on." They rode together, Cassidy seated in front of Degataga on his black horse, his arms keeping her secure. They traveled west from camp, following the river upstream to where the valley narrowed. After nearly an hour, they reached a place where a shelf of red rock jutted out over the water. Degataga helped Cassidy dismount, then led her carefully along a narrow path that climbed the rock face. At the top, the view opened up to reveal the entire valley spread below them. But it wasn't the view that made Cassidy catch her breath. It was what stood on the rock shelf itself. Someone had built a small structure here, 4 posts supporting a roof of carefully laid branches. Beneath it was a stone fire ring, a bench carved from a fallen log. And hanging from one of the posts, a piece of carved wood that bore names: Degataga, Ayana, Kimi, and below those, freshly carved, Cassidy. And a space left blank, waiting for the child not yet born. "I made this place," Degataga said quietly. "A place to remember the past and honor the future. Ayana and Kimi, they will always be part of me, part of my story. But you and our child, you are my life now. I wanted a place where all of it could exist together, where I could bring our child someday and tell them about the sister they never knew and the mother who came before, but also about the mother they do know. The one who survived impossible things to be here." Cassidy's eyes filled with tears. She reached up and touched the carved names, her fingers tracing the letters with reverence. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you for including me here." They sat together on the bench as the sun climbed higher. Degataga spoke of his plans to build a more permanent home near the healing lodge, a house with rooms for children and space for Cassidy's growing collection of medicines and books. Cassidy spoke of her hopes for the school, of wanting to expand it to include older students, of creating a place where Apache and white children might learn together. "Our child will be both and neither," Degataga said thoughtfully. "Apache and white, accepted fully by some and rejected by others. It will not be an easy path." "No," Cassidy agreed. "But they will have us. They will have this community. And they will have the strength that comes from knowing they were wanted, that they were loved from the moment we knew they existed. That's more than either of us had." When they returned to camp that afternoon, they found visitors waiting. Agent Whitmore had arrived with a small delegation, including a woman Cassidy recognized as Mrs. Adelaide Pratt, the shopkeeper's wife from Copper Ridge, who had witnessed her father trading her away more than 2 years ago. Cassidy forced herself to stand tall, her hand resting protectively on her belly. She was not the girl who had knelt on that saloon floor anymore. Mrs. Pratt approached slowly, her eyes reflecting complicated emotions. "Miss Merrick," she said, then corrected herself. "Mrs. Standing Bear, I heard you were here. I had to see for myself." "Why?" Cassidy asked steadily. Mrs. Pratt looked down at her hands, twisting her worn gloves. "Because I have been ashamed every day since that morning in the saloon. I stood there and watched your father trade you away, and I did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my business, but I knew it was wrong." She looked up, meeting Cassidy's eyes. "Agent Whitmore told me you had made a life here, that you were respected and happy. I had to come and see, had to know that you were all right. And I had to tell you I was sorry. Cassidy was quiet for a long moment, feeling Dagataga's presence steady beside her. She thought about all the anger she had carried for people who had seen her suffering and done nothing. But she also thought about the person she had become, the healer who understood that holding onto anger was poison. "I forgive you," Cassidy said finally, and meant it. "What happened that day was not your fault. It was my father's choice, and mine to survive it. But I appreciate you coming here and saying this. It takes courage." Mrs. Pratt's eyes filled with tears. "You have grown into a remarkable woman. Your mother would be proud." Agent Whitmore stepped forward then. "I actually asked Mrs. Pratt to accompany me, because I have news that concerns your father. Silas Merrick died 3 months ago. He was found in an alley behind a saloon in Tucson. The bottle finally killed him." "I'm sorry." Cassidy stood very still, trying to sort through the emotions that rose in her chest. But instead of grief or anger, she just felt tired, and a little sad for the man who had wasted his whole life chasing oblivion. "Did he suffer?" she asked. "I don't believe so," Whitmore said. "It was quick," Cassidy nodded slowly. "Then I hope he found some peace at the end." God knows he had none in life. After the visitors left, Cassidy walked to the river alone. She stood on the bank where she had once washed clothes while learning to belong, where she had pulled a drowning child from the current, where she had sat with Dagataga under moonlight and fallen in love. The water flowed past, eternal and unchanging, carrying everything downstream. She thought about the girl she had been, traded for a barrel of whiskey, worthless in her father's eyes. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the pain and the healing, the loss and the finding. And she thought about the life growing inside her, the child who would never know what it felt like to be unwanted. She heard footsteps behind her and knew without turning that it was Dagataga. He came to stand beside her, not speaking, just being present. After a while, she leaned against him. "I used to think that being saved meant someone rescuing you," Cassidy said quietly. "That you were powerless until someone stronger came along. But that's not what happened, is it?" "No," Dagataga agreed. "I gave you an opportunity. But you saved yourself. Every day, with every choice to keep going, to learn, to grow, to believe you deserved better." Cassidy placed her hand over her heart, feeling it beat strong and steady. "I was given away for a barrel of whiskey. But I'm worth so much more than that now. Not because of what anyone gave me, but because of what I built for myself. You were always worth more," Dagataga said firmly, turning her to face him and cupping her face in his hands. "You just had to learn to see it." They stood together as the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of rose and purple and gold. Behind them, the camp settled into its evening rhythms. Fires being lit, meals being prepared, children being called home. The baby kicked hard against her ribs. And Cassidy smiled, her hand moving to the spot. "Your daughter is impatient to meet the world," she told Dagataga. He placed his hand over hers, and together they felt the life they had created moving beneath their joined palms. "She will be strong," he said. "Like her mother, and brave," Cassidy added. "Like her father, and loved," Dagataga said, his voice thick with emotion. "That above all else, loved every single day of her life." As darkness fell over the valley and the first stars emerged in the endless sky, Cassidy felt a peace settle over her that she had never known before. She was home. She was valued. She was loved. And the girl who had once been worth only a barrel of whiskey had become a woman worth more than all the treasures of the earth. Not because someone had given her that worth, but because she had claimed it for herself.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.